Good afternoon. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful day. My name is Maria Safiotti-Dale, and as president of the Friends of the UW-Madison Libraries, I welcome you to the 2022 annual Chave Lecture by Dr. Johanna Drucker, Inventing the Alphabet, The Origins of Letters from Antiquity to the Present. For 74 years, the Friends organization has been championing our great library system here at UW-Madison. We are an all-volunteer organization that strives to bring visibility to campus libraries and to the world-class collections they hold. Our activities are made possible by donations in two different forms. We are happy to accept both monetary gifts and used books. When you donate books that you no longer need, we include them in our semi-annual book sale. The next sale is just 3 weeks away, October 12th to the 15th in Memorial Library. We'd love to see you all there. The money the Friends raise provides grant support to UW-Madison libraries and to scholars who come from around the world to do research in the exceptional library collections. It also provides funding for a wide variety of free public events and lectures. In 2006, the Friends received an endowment bequest from a beloved member of the Madison arts community, Douglas Chave, which came with a very specific charge, quote, to encourage the campus and the larger community to read print books and to host speakers with sound, balanced academic scholarship encouraging the diversity of study, or those speakers of contemporary literary merit, in furtherance of the sifting and winnowing principle of the University of Wisconsin. We hope to do just that this evening. In 2019, David Pavlich, Director of Special Collections and Kohler Art Library, approached the Friends about bringing Johanna Drucker to campus in celebration of the Kohler Art Library's 50th anniversary in 2020. Well, we all know what happened in 2020, and we are thrilled and grateful that Dr. Drucker is here on campus with us today. To introduce tonight's lecture, please welcome Anna Simon, the head of the Kohler Art Library. Thank you all.
We weren't sure if we could fill the auditorium, but we'll have to reconsider for the future. My name is Anna Simon, and I am the head of the Kohler Art Library, and I'm so honored to introduce our 2022 Chave Lecture speaker, Dr. Johanna Drucker. So as was just said, initially, Dr. Drucker was scheduled to be our 2020 Chave lecturer, and events did take a different turn that year. But as she also mentioned, originally 2020 was always the 50th anniversary of the Kohler Art Library, and that's how we approached 2020 as our special anniversary. Now, for those of you that don't know, the Art Library is right across East Campus Mall. It's connected to the Chazen Museum of Art by that sky bridge in the LVM building. And the Kohler Art Library was constructed some 50 years ago to house the university's art literature collection, as well as its original art collection and the art history department. So literally and figuratively, the Kohler Art Library has always supported these other units, being kind of tucked away there on the first floor. A lot of you probably walk by it and aren't even aware that it's there. The Kohler provides access to a rich collection of exhibition catalogs, historical scholarship, and special collections. And chief among these special collections is our artist book collection, which was founded 50 years ago when the library opened to offer students a hands-on laboratory for learning the book arts. Enabling the combination of scholarship and artistic practice is the zenith of an art library's mission, and this afternoon's speaker has spent her career doing just this, combining historical research and artist books to explore, among many things, the visual representation of language. Dr. Drucker is internationally distinguished as an author, book artist, visual theorist, and cultural critic. Her research focuses on alphabet historiography modeling, digital aesthetics, the history of visual information design, the history of the book and print, and visual knowledge representation. Her publications, which are quite numerous, include The Century of Artist Books from Granary Press in 1994, The History of Graphic Design, 2008, Order, Visualization, and Interpretation from MIT Press in 2020, and the Digital Humanities Coursebook in 2021. But since 1972, Drucker has also been creating artist books in which she experiments with visual language and topography, plays with visual forms of meaning production, and engages with theoretical topics in language and feminist issues. Her work has been exhibited internationally in university libraries and galleries, including the Kohler, and international museums, including the National Museum of Women in the Arts, Yale University, and the New York Public Library. Her newest book, released this year with the University of Chicago Press, is Inventing the Alphabet, The Origins of Letters from Antiquity to the Present. It is the first comprehensive intellectual history of alphabet studies. So before I turn the floor over to Dr. Drucker, I'd like to thank a few people who have made this event possible. Chief among them, the Friends of the Libraries, who have generously sponsored this afternoon's event. On behalf of the Friends, Libby Tuné has organized every detail of this lecture. David Pavlich, Director of Special Collections and Archives, helped conceptualize early on the bringing of Dr. Drucker to UW-Madison, and he's consulted on endless details. Levi Sherman, PhD student in art history and an accomplished book artist, graciously provided expertise and assistance with today. And finally, Lynn Korenik, who directed the Kohler Art Library for almost 20 years and worked tirelessly to build his artist book collection, first suggested bringing Dr. Drucker to speak to the UW libraries, and we owe her a debt of gratitude. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Johanna Drucker.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Lovely to be in Madison. It's a beautiful place. And I haven't really been here before to the university or to the city. And I'm enjoying very much your green, lush growth and the fact that you have water that falls from the sky. It's quite remarkable. Someday we're going to have that in California. So anyway, those of you who are standing in the back, there are some seats down here. If you want to move around while I'm making my preliminary remarks, you're welcome to do that. So it's a long time to stand. So I'm going to talk tonight about my new book, which is Inventing the Alphabet. And what I'm going to do is sort of three different things in the course of this talk, and hopefully not go on too long. But I thought I'd give you the outline of the talk. First, what I'd like to do is just say a few things about the book and its intellectual sort of project. And to do that, I need to establish just some fundamentals about the history of the alphabet itself. And this book is not a history of the alphabet. If you want a bibliography on the history of the alphabet, there's wonderful materials. But that's not what this book is. But to understand what the book is, we have to clear up some really fundamental confusions about the history of the alphabet itself. Where was it invented, by whom, when, and what do we know? Because the second part of my talk is really focused on the core of the book, which is who knew what when about the alphabet. And how did the way they knew it shape their understanding of what the alphabet was and what its invention consisted of? So the book is really coming from a constructivist point of view. It says you can't assume the alphabet in advance of knowledge about it. So the way that knowledge is produced across, essentially, the alphabet was invented about 3,700 years ago. But the knowledge about the alphabet and alphabet transmission, we really date to Herodotus in 440 BCE. So that's only 2,400 years, right? So instead of 3,700, we've got 2,400. But the point is that the knowledge about how the alphabet came into being what it was is traced through various lineages, intellectual lineages, but also different kinds of knowledge technologies. We're going to see things that only are transmitted by text. Well, that's one way of communicating knowledge. Other things come as images. Other things come as artifacts, and so forth. So this book is really about how we know about the invention and origin of the alphabet and the different intellectual lineages that sort of followed those different trails. And some of those lineages break off. So we'll see that there are epochs within intellectual history. That won't surprise you. There are hinge moments, for sure, within intellectual history, partly because of new innovations or discoveries, but also because paradigms shift. And we'll see what that is in just a second. So I'm going to start with some basics about the alphabet and its history, just to clear up confusions. Then I'm going to talk about the core of the book. And then I'm going to finish with a very short little, who cares? Because as I'm always saying to my students, okay, that's great that you love this thing, you're so obsessed about it, but so what? There has to be a takeaway. There has to be a reason why all of this matters. So those are the three parts of the talk, so let's launch in. So, of course, you recognize this, and you can read all of those letters in the crown here, and you know absolutely what you're looking at, and who doesn't know Chaldean letters? Yeah, right. So this is the origin myth of this project. In 1980, I was a graduate student at the University of California at Berkeley. I walked into Doe Library, where you could still go to the open stacks and take things off the shelves, including something that looked just like this, because it was this, 1667, Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont's, Alphabet of Nature. And it's this beautiful little book. I take it off, I open it up, and I think, OMG, what is this? So now, 40-some years later, I can answer that question for you, because I had no idea what those letter forms were. I knew the Hebrew letters. I know an Aleph. I know a Bet. But what's next to it? And next to that, and next to that. The fact that the guy's head is scraped open so that you can see that, in fact, all the letters match the articulatory organs, that's obvious, right? But where did those other letters come from? So that's kind of the origin myth, right? All right. But luckily, because there were open stacks, I could continue to peruse what was in the neighborhood. I'm a great champion of open stacks, librarians, okay? And most of what I know because I could wander through the neighborhoods of the Doe Library. So I begin to ask this question, okay, so how am I going to even find out what Mercurius von Helmont is putting in this crown, where these letter forms come from? What are they? So I found this miraculous book, which is called Pantographia, nothing like an ambitious title. I believe it's the accurate copies of all the known alphabets in the world, and so forth. This was a book done by a man named Edmund Fry, and it was printed in 1799. Fry was a punch cutter. And for those of you unfamiliar with the history of typography, that means he's the person who cut those little metal punches that were used to stamp a brass matrix to cast type. All right. And you'll see in a moment, he actually cut the punches for every single specimen in this book. And there's over 300 of them. It took him about 6 years. But he was trying to pull together all of the known alphabets of the world. So here's this Pantographia. And among the things he has in here are these Chaldeans. Oh, Chaldeans. We're going to get to those Chaldean letters. They're going to stick with us during the course of this talk. And so Chaldeans. Now, Fry was very generous to his future scholars like me. He hasn't had many future scholars. There have been a couple. But you will note that he tells you the source, Drucker, page 127. Now, who is Drucker? You got to figure out Drucker. You know, the treasure hunt here goes on and on. But Fry cited his sources. And this is 1799. And 1799 is going to factor in as an important intellectual hinge moment in a few minutes when I get to that. It's one of the paradigm shift moments. But look at this description, right? This is brought from the Holy Land of Venice when the Christian princes made war against the infidels. It's a handsome letter. It said it's the same one that Seth engraved upon 2 columns. All right, so we're going to start to see layered into Fry a compendium of historical references, frameworks of understanding that combine biblical, archaeological, technological, and other forms of knowledge. And really, 1799, he is the end point of a particular tradition because he is still working within a biblical timeline. And by within a few years, the geological timeline and deep time will begin to expand our understanding of historical time and require a complete shift in how we understand the origins and development of the alphabet as well as other historical formations. So, here it is. Okay, so the alphabet. Yeah, you're familiar with this. You may not know the Chaldean letters, okay, but you know these letters. And this is the place where in just a few slides, I'm going to give you some basics about the origin of the alphabet, its development, its spread, and its transformation. Because we look at these letters and we are also very familiar with these kinds of charts. You've seen these, since they show up. It's like, oh yeah, that was what the A looked like originally. Maybe there was an ox head there and there's the Beth and oh yeah, the Gimel. So, we're getting like, this is the Phoenician alphabet. That's what it's generally called. And those are the letter forms. And then we see how they will develop and come forward and become Hebrew. Oh, well, wait a minute, Phoenician Hebrew, what? But anyway, it's complicated there. But the point is that these glyph forms, which are called Phoenician, by the way, the term Phoenician is a historical anomaly. The Phoenicians did not identify themselves as Phoenician. They identified themselves by their cities. They were from Byblos, they were from Sidon, they were from Tyre. So the term Phoenician is a later term that gets applied to them. But anyway, we call this the Phoenician alphabet. What we do know is the alphabet set of glyphs that gets distributed by the Phoenicians, not invented by them, around the Mediterranean, originates in a cultural exchange in the Fertile Crescent between the writing forms of the north, which are cuneiform-based, but distill as cuneiform becomes increasingly used by an array of different language groups and speakers, into an analysis of the sounds of language. This is the intellectual breakthrough that is so profound, is to understand what are the significant sounds of a language and know that you need a limited set of signs to represent it. Very different from representing ideas, words, or concepts or things. So this happens as the cuneiform using cultures, and this is almost all the speakers in this region are speaking Afro-Asiatic languages. And the Semitic languages are the largest language group here, and then there's the Afro languages of North Africa, including Egyptian, which was not a Semitic language. So there's a language connection among all of these people. So cuneiform develops, and cuneiform's well developed by 3700 BCE. So it's old, right? Certainly by 2700 BCE. Whereas the alphabet's going to take another 1,000 years to distill. All right, so cuneiform writing, and then, of course, hieroglyphics in Egypt. Hieroglyphics appear about 2700 BCE with almost no like origin story. It's like they appear on the Narmer palette, and they're like already there. Where'd they come from? What's the development? So that's one of those unsolved, mysteries. You watch the History Channel, and the aliens no doubt did it. If you watch the History Channel, it's either Hitler or the aliens who did everything. Anyway, but we won't go there. So, but you see here that we have Canaan on the coast, And Chaldea is actually the land from which Abraham came when he came into Canaan. So the Chaldean letters are going to carry this biblical and historical reference. But there's also a kind of archaeological source for some of this material as well. But that's where the alphabet develops. And again, starting around 1700, 1800 BCE. So again, we're talking almost 4,000 years ago. And the evidence for this, which is discovered fairly late, 19th and 20th century, that'll be part of the story in a moment. The evidence for this, here's an inscription, this beautiful sphinx from Serabet el-Qadim. You see that it's on the Sinai Peninsula. It's part of a migration corridor, but it's also near turquoise mines, where there were Semitic workers who had been brought in to do work for Egyptians, Semitic speakers to do work with Egyptians to mine the turquoise. And so you can see that this is a little inscription here. It's actually proto-alphabetic, very early, around 1800 BCE. But it's on the Sinai. We're fine. We're still in a region that makes sense for migratory patterns, work patterns, trade, and exchange. That's great, right? That's found sometime in the early 20th century. And then in the 1990s, the story gets complicated when the Darnells, this pair of archaeologists, are hanging out in Egypt up the Nile. Okay, so now we're on the African continent. We're no longer in the Sinai. And Wadi El Hol inscription is found, and this is the Wadi El Hol inscription. And it's found, and it's the dating of these things. It's very difficult. They're outdoor inscriptions. They're on rock surfaces. But the study of the glyphs, the study of the signs, the translation of these, and just FYI, this is a hymn to Baal, the goddess Baal. And here's this Wadi El Hol. So it's like, oh no. It was all making sense when we thought there was some, this one area in the Fertile Crescent and along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. Now, what do we do with this older inscription that somehow is in this region far from, the Sinai and so forth? So there are questions yet to be fully resolved. And if you take a look, this kind of thing I spend my time on. I don't expect you to absorb all of this in the next 30 seconds. But if you look down the far column and you look at Sinai, Ugarit, Byblos, Hieratic, you'll see the dates. And what you're seeing essentially is that this development of signs that comes into being in this cultural exchange between cuneiform and hieroglyphics, Semitic speakers, gets distilled around, 1700 BCE and begins to modify, and yet you can recognize the signs as they move through these different geographic spaces. So the signs get passed around, not like a set of rubber stamps. Okay, the alphabet is never just a set of signs that are stable. They get passed from group to group. They get modified everywhere. Right, slightly altered, and new signs will get added to accommodate different language groups and so forth. But the alphabet spreads, and it's spread by what we call now Phoenician traders. And it goes into Asia Minor, the Greek mainland, the Greek islands, and so forth. Now, Greece had been literate in the Mycenaean period, but there's an end to the Mycenaean period. There's a Dark Ages. There's a complete dissolution. There's no evidence that there's continuity of literacy. Believe me, I can give you the bibliography on the debates on that one if you want. But by about the 8th century BCE, the alphabet has migrated into the Greek islands and mainland, but also into Iberia, also along the North African coast, also along all of the Asia Minor coast. So it's spreading with trade. It makes sense. But where did it develop? Where did it consolidate? And the current research believes that the transmission of the alphabet to the Greeks probably occurred on Turkey in Asia Minor, in places where there was a long enough settlement for the exchange to take place. It couldn't have just happened from Phoenicians showing up with olive oil to trade. There had to be consistent settlement for the idea of writing to take place and for a Greek-speaking Indo-European speakers, not Semitic speakers, to absorb and adapt the script. So just FYI, again, I'm not going to expect you to absorb all of this. There's only one source for all alphabetic scripts. It is the Proto-Canaanite taproot that develops around 1800, 1700 BCE. You see it up at the top. And then the Canaanite linear alphabet gets distilled, the Phoenician, as we call it, and you can see that becomes the source for Aramaic and Nabatean, Syriac, Jewish, which becomes modern Hebrew, right? Paleo Hebrew is a whole other story. We'll go back to it. You see colonial Phoenician, you see Archaic Greek, you see Greek on the left, Etruscan, Latin, but you also, on the far right here, all the Indian scripts develop. So, and Arabic, right? So that all these things that look different are the same structurally. The letters have the same names. Alif is Aleph is Alpha. They have the same names, they have the same sequence, and they have the same powers. By powers, we mean the sound they represent. Now, again, different languages have different needs. The Greeks had a need for more explicit vowel notation than the Semitic roots did. So they did add letters in, but they knew that. All right, and just, we won't go into this, but you can see that except for the scripts, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, that should say script, the alphabet is ubiquitous, right? These alphabetic scripts, all right, modified in form, adapted for different languages, but from the same taproot and the same names, sequence, and structure. So the Greeks knew that they did not invent the alphabet. They knew it, okay? Herodotus, writing in 440, is writing about, inscriptions that he's seeing, but he's writing a text. And he knew that the alphabet had come from the East. The term Cadmus in Greek means from the East. So Cadmus, the Phoenician, it means generically the Phoenicians have brought the alphabet. So now we can sort of begin to switch gears a little bit and think a little bit about knowledge transmission technologies and start with Herodotus. But I'm going to pause for just a second to summarize, therefore, the fundamentals of where the alphabet develops, ancient Near East, cultural exchange. It becomes consolidated as a usable set of signs that then circulate around the Mediterranean and into North Africa, down into Ethiopia, down into the Arabic peninsulas, and over into across the Indus Valley into India and all the subcontinents, right? And then it comes to the New World, right, as part of colonial expansion, and so forth. So anyway, that's just to kind of put in place the kind of fundamentals of alphabet history. But now let's talk about the who knew what when and how did they know it. So Herodotus was fully aware that Herodotus, the Greek historian, writing 440 BCE, writes the first text that is still extant that is about alphabets. He doesn't use the word alphabet, which is a Latin word. He uses the word grammaton, the whole stoichia grammata. There's a whole discussion there. But the point is that Herodotus knows full well that it is an import. And he writes a text about it, very interesting and longish text. Now, I'm going to describe this to you. There are some inscriptions on a bronze vase that hangs here in this temple of such and such. And they have 17 characters, but we later added, 3 more and 2 more and whatever. Okay, I dare you, draw that script. Draw that script. Well, you can't, because it's a textual transmission. It's a textual description. So the question of what were the inscriptions that Herodotus saw and what were the Greek letter forms at that time is a topic of incredible debate and discussion. Lillian Jeffrey, the fantastic classical scholar of the mid-20th century, used Herodotus' text to organize her study of all the inscriptions of archaic Greece because she was interested in seeing how it would match Herodotus' text. But she had images by then because the corpus had been, put together. So textual transmission only tells us certain things. We don't know what the script is that we do now thanks to Lillian Jeffrey. But textual transmission is limited in certain ways. Bibliographical transmission does another thing, right? It standardizes a text so it can be cited. Herodotus' text gets pretty stable by around the 11th century. But before that, it depends on who's copying, right? It's like which versions to include. So again, just to, remind ourselves, the script that comes into the Greek, mainland and islands, takes various forms. And there are people, this happens to be Flinders Petrie, who inventory every single glyph and every single scratch mark sign in order to take a look at the differences, the modifications, what gets varied and modified where. But that can only happen much later when we have epigraphy, the study of inscriptions, and archaeology. And so the question of, what these signs are will be debated through antiquity for quite some time, because epigraphy and archaeology are 19th century studies, a little bit of the 18th century. All right. Now, not to be left out, we have the biblical stories of the invention of the alphabet. And of course, the alphabet in, the book of Genesis is given to Moses with the tablets. The tablets are the first thing written. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai. He receives the law. It just so happens that every letter of the alphabet is represented in the Decalogue, so we can tell that's the case. Where are those tablets? I mean, I don't even think the British Museum has those, right? Okay, so, so there's the tablets. So we get this story that, Moses gets the alphabet with the law. All right, but what alphabet does he get? Now, I can tell you, the question of what alphabet Moses was using occupies more ink in the history of debates than you can possibly imagine. And this will get us back to von Helmont at the end to find out what those letters are in the crown, because we're going to see Paleo-Hebrew become a set of signs that gets discovered and passed on. All right, but not in the biblical tale. Okay, so if you think it's complicated to figure out what Moses was doing and how Moses could write when he couldn't read, and so these are big debates, right? Then the question is, but wait, then comes Josephus in the 1st century, and he starts telling this story about the sons of Adam. Now, by my calculations, and hopefully by yours as well, Adam precedes Moses, by quite a long period of time. Now, Josephus tells a story about how Adam's sons, Seth, Adam's on his deathbed, and Seth is saying to Adam, what should I do to preserve, everything you've taught us? And Adam says, you must go and make 2 pillars, one of stone and one of brick, and you must write on it everything that you know. So wait, how did Seth, what's he writing with? Like, what alphabet is Seth using? So then this whole question about, oh my gosh, then there's Seth and the oldest alphabet. Now wait, how can Seth have had writing if Moses gets it from God? And so these debates occupy, many, many thinkers with, very deep commitment to figuring out the answers. One of the problems is, ain't no evidence. We don't have those pillars of Seth, in case you haven't noticed, and we don't have the tablets. So there's a lot of reconstruction work that's going to have to go on. So we come back here to my friend, von Helmont, and now we begin to think, okay, we've got Hebrew, and then we've got these things with circles on the end, and then we've got something that looks like an F made out of, barbells, and then we have something else, right? And it's like, well, interestingly enough, if we go to Edmund Fry in 1799, guess what? Look at what he's got there for the A. All right, to help you out, I'm going to put these things next to each other. The thing that looks like an F is in the crown. It's number 4, right? Paleo-Hebrew. So the Chaldean number 3, and look at the bet in the Chaldean number 3. It's the 4th item in the crown on the right. So somehow, by 1799, Edmund Fry has got a sufficiently codified Paleo-Hebrew to be able to show that this, set of letter forms existed in a fixed form. That's pretty incredible, right? So again, these lineages, where does this stuff come from? How does it get passed on? And again, thankfully, Fry gives us all his bibliographical references. So you can begin to track them once you can figure out Dr. Morton How many Dr. Mortons do you think there are in the corpus of intellectual history in Western culture? Try tracking down Dr. Morton. Okay, so this occupied me for 40 years, and you can kind of see why. I tracked down every single reference in Edmund Fry. That was one of my start points, because I knew if I did that, I would have something to start with. So the next kind of technology of knowledge production after we have the text and we have the biblical tales is visual. And in the Middle Ages, we have copying of exemplars. And this is Isidore of Seville's Etymologia, and this is an 8th century manuscript, and you can see the Greek letters here. So the sort of interest in classifying, codifying, and passing on knowledge is part of the scribal tradition, and so we start to have serious, sort of copying and passing on. Well, copying works great if you have something to copy. Now, what happens when you have a mystical alphabet, an angelic alphabet, or an alphabet like the one you can barely see, but it's on the far right column? This is the alphabet associated with Ethicus Ister. Anybody here familiar with, Drew must be, somebody familiar with Ethicus Ister? So Ethicus Ister is a mythic figure who travels to the east, right, pilgrimage, and comes back with an exotic alphabet. So the alphabet of Ethicus Ister, now he's mythic, he doesn't exist, but his alphabet, his script, becomes stabilized in a set of copies that gets circulated throughout Europe. You can't copy this script if you don't have it. I can describe Ethicus Ister's alphabet to you, the Alaman, the Bic, and so forth, and I can say, well, the Alaman has like 2 arms and they lean over and kind of hug each other, right? And so you can't unless you see it. So what's remarkable in the Middle Ages, 8th century, 9th century, is that this script, where's the Alaman Bic? It's there, the one on the far right, okay, gets copied and passed around. It's never an alphabet used to write anything because it's made up. It's a myth. It's a mythic alphabet, and yet, as a set of visual exemplars, the specimen is stable and gets passed. So I find this amazing, remarkable. But it depends on having an exemplar present. You can only do this if you see it and can copy it. And then it comes into print. This is Rabinus Maurus. Rabinus Maurus, the Bishop of Fulda, established an incredible library. He's an important figure for this. And there's Ethicus's alphabet, in the mix here. It's the second one down. And again, it shows that there is a stable transmission record that is visual. And again, where's this coming from? How does it work? And the questions that Rabinus Maurus is asking are also about origins and development. So we have this kind of tradition of visual knowledge transmission that allows other kinds of questions to be asked. But along with that, we get a certain kind of mystical investment in the origin of the alphabet, and we get a different story. This is Guillaume Postel's 1538 chart. It doesn't actually come out of this particular book, though they're both printed in the same, published in the same period. Postel's an amazing figure, and he's putting together a compendium again of scripts, and you can see the scripts in his, the 6 scripts he's put on his title page. But Postel is also a Kabbalist, and he begins to, again, he sees the letter forms as based on the stars, that the origin of the Hebrew letters is in the stars. And because it's in the stars, it's made by God. And therefore it confirms certain kinds of biblical beliefs, because if it's celestial, it is divine. And so the letter forms in the celestial alphabet get codified. Now, this has another sort of longer history, and there's Arabic manuscripts with these celestial scripts, and the celestial scripts have their own history. But that history gets codified and begins to be passed on, so that we have Postel, and then we have Gaffarel copying him right below. And then we see this show up in Edmund Fry in 1799, taken from Gaffarel, plate 1. Now, Gaffarel got it directly from Postel, whom he copied without attribution. Those were the days. So they didn't have to turn it in. And then here's Agrippa copying these letters as well in the 1530s. So again, these mythic alphabets, celestial alphabets, and angelic alphabets get codified and passed on as visual exemplars well into the print era. And you can still find them on the purple and silver sites, with the sparkling stars and stuff. And some of which have some very useful information on them, I should say. And here's another alternative to the celestial script. This one is the Malachim. It's called the character of angels, right? It's associated with the angels. And there are many of these scripts that are associated with individual angelic figures and so forth that are stable visual specimens, but never used for writing. Nobody wrote in a celestial script. So this material exists in manuscripts and it exists in print form. And in 1616, the librarian of the Vatican Library, James Bonaventure Hepburn, put together this enormous, you're seeing just the top of what's a very long plate that has 72 scripts on it. And he's trying to also put together all of the known scripts that exist in 1616 that he can get from the library. And notice that we have here the alphabets of the seraphs, the alphabets of the celestial alphabets, right? The angel alphabets, put right next to, Canaan, Chaldean, which is actually a form of Arabic, Palestinian, Persian. So in other words, this is all seen as part of a shared history. There's no distinction made between these, alphabets of the Seraphim and the alphabets of the Persians. These are all scripts that have stability that are passed on that Hepburn finds, right? So there's no kind of sense that there's any problem here with distinguishing scripts in use from scripts that have a pedigree within another intellectual belief set. And which I respect completely. I think that's, worth considering in terms of our own, sense that now we know things. Like maybe we don't. Okay. So by the time you get to Athanasius Kircher, and for those of you who've never stumbled across Athanasius Kircher, he's the great Renaissance polymath who, with his Jesuit brotherhood, publishes a whole series of very elaborately illustrated volumes that try to collect all known knowledge on many, many topics, volcanoes and, planets and, language and, you name it, right? They're amazing, amazing volumes. And he publishes this table in 1669 in his book called The Tower of Babel. Needless to say, the whole Babel story factors in here, but we won't go there today. I'll let you do that one. When you're playing Scrabble, you can, deal with Babel. All right. So, but here's this table, and notice that he has, the Hebrew letters down the side. He has what he calls Syriac next to that, right, and so forth. And then look at that central column. Now we're starting to see, again, these Paleo-Hebrew letter forms, right? But then if we go over, skip a column and go over, then you see the celestial scripts again showing up. So again, here's, Kircher, polymath, pulling all these things together in a chart form. Now the chart is has its own intellectual rhetoric. Charts can be ways to compare, and they can be ways to show development. But all charts require that you lift the glyph, the sign, out of its context. We don't know what material it was made in. We don't know what size it was. We don't know, what sat next to it. So the chart is very powerful, but it's also problematic. So lo and behold, a few years later, Willem Gorey, the Dutch historian of biblical knowledge, decides to take Athanasius Kircher's chart and embed it in a biblical scene. So Gary, sort of completely recontextualizes this, puts a narrative tale around it, right? And these figures you can see in the background, the obelisk, you can see, the kind of character, the coins, you can see this, Hebrew and Paleo inscription down below, right? And our muscular biblical figure. So, the ancients had it. The ancients were buff. All right. So, but here's Gary taking this and copying it and passing it on as a chart, but recontextualizing. So again, these lineages are traceable in terms of who's copying what and passing it on. Geary does this with a whole set of inscriptions and putting them all into context so that you see, the angel Raphael, you see Abraham leaving, Chaldea to go to Canaan. You see, you get these stories told as kind of Sunday school stories, biblical history stories. So they're quite remarkable. So that was the 1690s. We're coming to the end of the 17th century. And Kircher is a rational man. He's trying to do systematic knowledge, sorting and publishing. But he doesn't yet really have at his disposal the evidence he needs, right? There's the obelisk and there's, materials and so forth. But when we get to the 18th century, just a few years later, we begin to have a whole antiquarian culture. And these are individuals who are very learned, very educated, who are trying to sort through the existing evidence for the knowledge of antiquity. Now, this is still before James Hutton and geological time comes into play, but these are serious antiquarians. And Bernard de Montfaucon goes to every collector's cabinet of antiquities that he can get access to with an artist and draws these plates. Bernard de Montfaucon's Antiquity Explained is a comprehensive record of what was in collections of antiquities in the early 18th century. It was just remarkable, monster book, right? Huge thing. In his introduction, Montfaucon says there's nothing like physical evidence, because when you can see the object, there's so much you can read from it. It's materials, it's inscriptions, it's making, it's history, everything. It's like, this is our guy, right? And he is saying, but there is nothing that confirms biblical history. We do not have any physical evidence. Now, there's a few Maccabean coins. There's a few coins from the Jewish uprising against the Romans, but that's late, right? There's nothing that stretches back before that. So Montfaucon, really bemoans this. He's like, how can we certify the authenticity of biblical knowledge if we have no evidence? And so, he's looking, right? And there really is very little. Get a little bit later in the 18th century, this is the amazing Edmund Chisel, and you can see that these coins are ancient Hebrew coins, and they have Paleo-Hebrew on them, and he inscribes the coins, and he puts these into his, sort of history of ancient scripts. So coins are beginning to surface, but what's the problem with coins? We don't know where they were located. We don't necessarily know where they were minted unless we have historical evidence that we can correlate, the name of the ruler and so forth. So we're still looking at evidence that's deracinated. All the antiquarian material is deracinated. It is no longer in its homeland. It's not where it was found. And we will have to wait for archaeology to be able to locate evidence in space. But luckily, archaeology is going to come along in the 19th century, biblical archaeology. And again, we are looking at a completely changed landscape intellectually. We now have deep time. We have a much longer sense of the history of the earth within which to, sort of situate human development. It's still fairly primitive. But we then, in 1855, this is a monument of incredible importance in terms of the intellectual ripple effect that it had. And interestingly, the first copy of the inscription on the sarcophagus went to the Institute in Albany, New York, which was considered the cutting edge of historical knowledge. And within a few weeks of this discovery, they have this copy and they're debating, what it means and what it says and so forth. So, thanks for the internet, you can find the publication of those debates and the inscription in the Albany Institute's, records. So this amazing thing is the Eshmanazar sarcophagus. Now, it's not as old as the invention of the alphabet. It's only the 6th century BCE. And as you can see, it's I'll show you a close-up in a minute. If this ain't gorgeous, I don't know what is. Look at that script. That is clearly script that is well established, inscribed by a very skilled engraver who knows those forms so well that they aren't copying them, they're making them. And this is an important distinction as well. When you don't know a letter form or a glyph, you have to copy it as if it's a picture. When you know the letter forms, you have ductile knowledge, you have hand knowledge. So this Eshmanazar sarcophagus is discovered right near either Byblos or near Sidon by a French diplomat, because this is after the dissolution of the Turkish Empire, and then the French are moving into this region. You have to realize that the ancient Near East was really hard to travel to. And there were not first of all, excavation and the whole notion of archaeology is a 19th century notion. But the evidence for the classical past, for Rome, for Greece, was above ground. You could see it, right? The evidence for the palace at Nineveh, right, Ashurbanipal's library, the ancient Near East was all buried under sand. It wasn't evident. And I'm sorry, my ancestors, but the Semites did not build monuments, right? They didn't make big temples. They were Semitic nomadic tribes who were, migrating around and working in turquoise mines and doing, and surviving, but they were shepherds and so forth. So they did not build monuments. That was not part of the culture. So what remains? Okay, so this, by the time you get to the kings of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, these are major monuments, but they're, much later. But this shows the Phoenician script in a state of, fully developed maturity. But the point is that this script, when it's found, when the Eshmanazar sarcophagus is found, this it's the first time that in the biblical homeland, evidence has been found of the biblical past, because these are figures who are described in the Old Testament. So, this is earth-shattering for intellectual history, okay? Found in the homeland and unearthed. Needless to say, the Frenchman decides it should go to France, and a French, nobleman pays for it to go. It's removed from its site on an ox cart, and the ox are all decorated with flowers, and there's a whole, it's a whole event. It's a whole major cultural event. And again, the inscription is about the kings themselves and about families and lineages and so forth. So as I'm coming toward the end here, the kind of core, you're seeing that we've moved from copying from text, to, visual exemplars, to, copying techniques, into, study of coins and evidence, antiquities, and then into archaeology. And again, archaeology spatializes and locates the historical past. But then I put this in here. It's a whole detour we won't go into. There remain questions about the relationship between the Semitic, development of the alphabet and the Egyptian language and Egyptian signs. And there's an ongoing, there's a whole sort of debate throughout the 19th and early 20th century about whether there was an Egyptian origin for alphabet development. You sort of see it there. But by the time we get into the early 20th century, the study of epigraphy, of inscriptions, has become a developed, mature scientific field. And I say scientific really to wave at a set of techniques for looking at script forms as empirical evidence. So to look really in such detail, is there a variation in the length of the tail? Is there a variation in the orientation? Is there a variation in, any of the strokes or the signs? Mark Lidzbarski is one of the people who makes Northern Semitic epigraphy and Western Semitic epigraphy into a full-blown science. And if you go through his books, this is the Aramaic, writing table. You see Aramaic, you see Palmyrene, you see Nabatean, and you see all of these things are located to their source point, so that they can be compared. So he is really constructing a systematic knowledge of all known inscriptions of the time. Now, the corpus of Semitic inscriptions is relatively small, compared especially to cuneiform. Cuneiform, we've got really hundreds of thousands of cuneiform inscriptions. Semitic inscriptions, the corpus is in the hundreds. And so the study of these glyphs is really extensive. And then, the discovery of that little sphinx that I showed you, and of other inscriptions in the Sinai took place when Flinders Petrie and his wife Hilda stopped en route in the Sinai. They were on their way to Jerusalem on a diplomatic mission. He was the great Egyptologist of the period. And while they were fixing dinner and fixing camp, Hilda went for a little walk and came back and said, "Hey, I think there's something over here you need to look at," and, began to find these inscriptions. Petrie had a very interesting theory. This is 1912, which is interesting for those of you who know anything about the history of linguistics, because his theory corresponds and rhymes with the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, whom he wouldn't have known. But it's a structuralist approach. It says the alphabet is not a set of signs made and distributed. It's a formation among Mediterranean peoples that emerges through trade and exchange. So he has a really interesting theory on the formation of the alphabet, and he does systematically put this study of signs together. So, but Petrie's an archaeologist. Lidzbarski is an epigrapher, and the difference is important because the epigraphers look at every single glyph, sign, mark, and so forth. The Ahiram sarcophagus, found in 1923, again, very important early inscription that you can see on the lid of the sarcophagus. I throw this in here at the end simply to say that the number of discoveries that occurred in the late 19th through the 20th into the early 20th century transformed alphabet studies, because none of this stuff was known before. And the Ahiram sarcophagus is a monument, but this is as monumental as it gets, right? There's not going to be any inscriptions over doorways in marble. In fact, what they're going to be are ostraca, potsherds, very kind of insignificant seeming remains that become so important in the way that they can be read. I mean, here, this is from the 6th century BCE, written before the sack of Jerusalem. It contains much historical knowledge, but the question is, what is the state of the script form, and what does it tell us about the communities of exchange within which the alphabet stabilized? And so you get this kind of material, this, from Byblos, the milk inscription, all of this stuff, so that, you have figures like Israel Finkelstein and Benjamin Sass, consummate epigraphers, who can take a shard that has 1.5 glyphs on it, right? And say, oh, because of the shape of the tail here and this stroke here, this has to have been made before 1400 and after 1700 and someplace northeast of such and such. So the importance of this little bit of material, it's like the cultural DNA, right? So from that little finger bone, you can extrapolate all of this material. So, it's just really still an ongoing discovery. But the discoveries are of these bits of ancient remains, again, piecing together from material evidence and its place in geographical as well as chronological time, how that evolution occurred. And so it's still ongoing work in many ways. Again, the Wadi El Hol inscription, here put next to this, 10th century BCE, jasper seal. And again, you can see the letter forms at the bottom of this little seal that look much more like the Paleo-Hebrew signs that were in the Chaldean crown of Mercurius von Helmont. So to finish up here, the last 2 slides, here's our family tree of early alphabetic scripts, Proto-Canaanite at the bottom, and then you see all of these things branching off and becoming the variants of script that appear in the current world, right? So to finish up, and then I'll do my little tiny coda, we see that the way that the alphabet is understood changes over time, in part because of the way that knowledge about the alphabet is transmitted through different kinds of materials and techniques and technologies, and also as other kinds of frameworks change within the history of knowledge itself, so that, again, the shift from biblical time to geologic time allows archaeology to have a different kind of legitimacy than it would have had in an earlier period. And then epigraphy as a field just becomes so sophisticated that the knowledge of every single glyph in the existing Semitic corpus, they all have numbers, named, every single glyph. I mean, it's a very, very well charted territory and highly sophisticated. So that's what the book is about. It goes through these different periods and these different, sort of formations, and also looks at the way that they end. Much of what's in Fry in 1799 would never show up in Joseph Neves. Neves is a serious epigrapher, and as far as those folks are concerned, celestial alphabets, angelic alphabets have no place in the study of Semitic epigraphy. But for me, in alphabet studies, all of this is part of the way that we understand, the way that, we conceptualize the alphabet, its identity, its role, its origins, its value. My last slide here, Unicode. It says Phoenician on the top. I've already told you that the Phoenicians are an invention of modern history. Now, there's a debate in the Unicode community about whether Paleo-Hebrew and Phoenician should have different Unicode signs. This is important, culturally speaking. There's a lot at stake, all right? And we won't go into it at the moment. But the reason this slide is up here, besides that, is that the alphabet, this set of signs invented by Semitic tribes, right, nomadic tribes, 1700 BCE, there's a little set of signs, undergirds global communication in the internet. Okay, there it is, along with Arabic numerals, right? It's alphanumeric notation, right? And, we can represent scripts, glyphs, all kinds of things on screen. But the efficiency and the sort of, intellectual muscle of the alphabet as a system of discrete signs that can function efficiently and effectively is such that it undergirds the internet. And sometimes it just gives me absolute chills to realize that there's this continuous lineage into the present, and that, in fact, the hegemonic, force of the alphabet as a global control system is kind of amazing to think about. So I end with Unicode, and you can see there are these, glyphs that are Phoenician, as it were, and where's our Paleo-Hebrew, and there's a lot of distance between Paleo-Hebrew and the Phoenician signs, and so the question of whether it's just a different library of glyphs but the same Unicode values is one that gets debated, or whether or not we need a different Unicode set to do that. So it's just to say there's still there's still active implications of the way in which alphabet studies are proceeding. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. Yeah, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you for that amazing talk. I have a couple questions, if that's all right. The first one, it's more just like I want to hear more interesting stories. And so I was wondering, I really loved what you had to say about deracination, the decontextualization of language parts, and I was wondering if you have any interesting stories of mistransmission that arose from this practice of deracination. And then the second one, I just wrote down now from your amazing conclusion, do you have any stories about interesting resistances to the hegemonic force of the alphabet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's a whole politics to alphabet studies, to be sure, which, again, if you look at the book, you'll see when did the alphabet become Greek and who made it Greek. So I owe much of my insight on that topic to the work of Martin Bernal and his study, the Cadmean Letters. So there are many, mistransmission, mistranslation happen all the time. And even, one of the things that's problematic is that you have a set of signs, but they don't have an allegiance to a single language. So the signs can be used for any number of languages. Okay, so they get used for Indo-European languages, they get used for Semitic languages, they get used for, whole families of languages. And so, I'm not going to name names because, I have respect for all of these different scholars. But there was a recent publication that was looking at the Sinai inscriptions and claiming to be able to read them as Hebrew. And that incurred all kinds of wrath from people who said it's not Hebrew, it's this, or it's Aramaic, or it's, So again, if I take a set of signs and put them up, and I say to you, okay, read it, you might decide it's Latin and that there's just a few letters missing and read it as a Latin inscription. But you might also, I might say, no, that's actually, it's actually Hebrew. But you say, but it doesn't look like Hebrew signs. I said, yes, but they're representing in transliteration the Hebrew language. So one of the structural challenges is to match the language of the inscription with the inscription. And that takes a lot of archaeological information, because who were the people moving through the Sinai, making those inscriptions in 1700 BCE? And do we know what language they spoke? And if so, so again, that's a huge structural problem. So that, it's very difficult. And then we have all the wonderful forgeries. So of course, that the Phoenicians came to Brazil. So there's a whole story about the Phoenician inscription in Brazil. And so that's so we get those things as well. There's some Phoenician inscriptions on the walk I take in Los Angeles with a friend of mine, and I keep thinking I'm going to take some photographs so I can show evidence of the Phoenicians having been in California. So, it's one of the things that, again, is so mind-boggling is when you look at these things, okay, this is a really carefully done photograph in raked light that has been manipulated to make this inscription show. All right, you're walking through the desert, through this, this is in Egypt, but the Sinai inscriptions, you're walking, they're up high, they're inaccessible, they're little scratchings in the rock. What's a scratching on the rock and what's part of the rock, right? It's not after, 4,000 years of weather. So again, there's a lot of problems just with the, reading of the physical evidence as well. So these are huge, issues. Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
I got two very brief questions for you. The first is, how did the misnomer Arabic numeral come about? When one looks at Arabic, numbers in Arabic today, they bear absolutely no resemblance to the numerals used in the West. My second question, could you say something about the Rosetta Stone? Was that really the breakthrough that it's regarded as today, or is it overrated?
Well, the Rosetta Stone was very important because it allowed, decipherment of hieroglyphics. And Thomas Young had been working on that, and then Champollion and so forth. So, and also I think its metaphoric value is so important because we have the concept of a Rosetta Stone as a result. But the Rosetta Stone was crucial. How you decipher a lost language if you do not have something to correlate is a challenge. I'll let somebody else answer the Arabic numeral question. The source point for invention of the numerals and so forth, and then their, transmission, modification, and so forth is another tale of cultural history. And I actually don't deal with the numerals in my text. I had enough to deal with the unruly letters of the alphabet, right? So, you had a question in the back. About the letter G? Gimel? Oh, J? Well, J and U are added late, as we know. And, so that's why they sit in a funny place in the typecase. They're still being treated as latecomers. But it's, again, the question is, at what point is the discrete sound value important enough to need its own representation? And also there were letters in Old English, like the thorn and that got dropped because the thorn was very useful for the mix of Germanic and Celtic sounds that were part of the English language in Middle English, but it gets dropped. We don't use it anymore. So now there's lots of work on the symbols, symbolic value of the letters. And again, so if you want to find out, the mystical power of the J, there's plenty of source material for that. And not all of it is wackadoodle, just most of it. But it's like the whole notion that that the letters evolved from pictographs, and the A was the ox head, and that the B was the house, and so forth. There's a principle called the acrophonic principle that has to do with naming the letters for a word they start with, a word that starts with that letter. And then, so if Aleph, that was the word for ox, then we use that as a mnemonic, and then people see the ox in the letter form. But, it's like that whole, the ox is these things have, again, very kind of dodgy, sort of lineages in various ways. And nothing's that linear, right? That's the other thing to remember, is that it's not as if this emerges, it takes shape, and it gets distributed and stays stable. Right. I mean, it's just like dialects and, sound change in language, or change in cuisine, right? Like what happens to paprika as it moves through different cultures, right? So again, it's very similar, right? These things become adopted, adapted, modified, and transformed. So, yes.
I've always wondered about W and double V.
And double I and double me. So, right, exactly. Yeah. Okay, one more question. Says Anna. Yes. Yes. I don't know who had their hand up first. I think you probably did. I'm sorry.
I'm really intrigued by this book, but also, love your work on digital humanities. And so I wanted to ask whether is there a part of this story where the invention of digital tools has changed the way that we process this kind of information? Was that the kind of leap that some of the other leaps you've discussed are? I guess I do have more stories.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the use of digital technology has radically changed the access to formerly illegible materials. And there's a project called Inscriptifact that's part of the West Semitic Epigraphy project at USC. And they've worked with pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And, again, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest extant biblical manuscripts we have. They go back to the 2nd century BCE, so not that far, but they're still the oldest. And, you look at some of those pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and man, they look like burnt chocolate chip cookie. Okay, you cannot. And then, but you can take that sample, put it into, and these guys designed this equipment, put it into an imaging device that looks at sound resonance, infrared resonance, in other words, takes different kinds of technologies of imaging and then aggregates them together computationally in order to make them legible. So that kind of material engagement with digital humanities and evidence, I think, is really amazing. So there is a kind of extension of our capacity to know. But again, I would put that into the larger paradigm here, which is to say that's not the last word. In other words, to imagine that the digital is a kind of ultimate, right, ne plus ultra of empiricism is to be naive. It is a set of techniques that allow certain things to be seen and understood that were not before. But that doesn't mean there aren't still aspects of knowledge that are not available to us, and that, in fact, that kind of claim to empiricism blinds us to. And this is where I go back to my respect for, the figures like Fry, who are so inclusive as to say, these are belief systems that have integrity and authenticity in their own right. Whether they correspond to historical knowledge, they correspond to the history of human ideas. And I think it's important to keep that distinction in mind, that beliefs are not necessarily to be tested on the grounds of empiricism.
That's a good note.